Today, we continue a series of briefings on what many experts call a fight to save representative democracy in the United States, from securing access to the ballot box to ensuring that communities can elect leaders to represent them through fair redistricting. In late April, we co-hosted with the Leadership Conference Education Fund a briefing on two federal bills aimed at blocking the surge of voter suppression bills in many states. Today, our experts and advocates will update you on developments at both the national and state level that may mark a turning point in this battle, and on what comes next.
When people ask me why the bill is so big, I say it's because there is a lot in American democracy to fix. And so I like to joke that this is actually just Congress doing its job. This is what bills are supposed to look like, frankly, especially when there's so much to be done in this moment. So a couple of quick highlights. First, the bill includes automatic voter registration, which has been in place all over the country in red states and blue states successfully for a very long time. That would bring tens of millions of American voters onto the rolls. Same-day voter registration, which again has been in place safely and securely all across the country, but we know actually would have a wonderful effect for communities of color in particular and young people, which we know are one of the most demographically diverse generations that we've seen. Believe it or not, 10 states in America do not have online voter registration yet. This bill would fix that. And it would also supply 2 weeks of early voting. Many of us are all too familiar with that one day on Tuesday. If you just you get on the subway a little bit late, you're giving up your right to vote for that entire election cycle. And that doesn't make any sense in modern America. So this bill would provide 2 weeks of early voting with hours before and after. So if you're one of the many Americans, again, particularly women, people of color, and lower wage workers who do not have flexibility to stand in line at the polls, often for hours, as we saw, unfortunately, in the last election, early voting would take the pressure off of that one day, which also would benefit election administrators. Very importantly, the bill would restore the vote to Americans who are out of jail or prison and living in their community. And that could affect about 4 million Americans, 1.7 of whom are Black and Latino Americans. It bans partisan gerrymandering. So while racial gerrymandering is already prohibited, we often see partisan gerrymandering allow politicians to draw their districts to choose their voters rather than letting voters just choose the people who should lead them. This bill would stop partisan gerrymandering and open the process to let in the public. It prohibits discriminatory voter purges, provides grants for election security and election administration, so that states can get paper ballots, that voters can know that their votes are cast and counted as cast, and there are trails that we can trust and rely on. And then it fundamentally transforms the campaign finance system in America, which is, funnily enough, one of my favorite parts of the bill, even though I'm a voting rights advocate, because I think we are asking questions about whether people can vote, and the campaign finance reforms make us ask questions like, well, who should we let them vote for, right? This is our America, and we need to make sure that every American is at the table. It's because it's fundamentally asking a question about what it would look like to have an inclusive American democracy. And it's making infrastructural changes to bring people into the table who have been left aside before. And the way that I like to illustrate why this is important, small dollar public financing will bring in everyday Americans. Why does that matter? The 117th Congress, our current Congress, is the most diverse in American history. The most diverse. It is 77% white. It is 73% male. Fewer than 5% of Congresspeople in the last Congress reported ever having worked a blue-collar job. And when women, of people of color, when working class and middle class Americans can't be at the table, the majority of Congress are millionaires. When you start to look at those statistics, you begin to realize why the policies that matter to everyday Americans, healthcare, education, stopping the planet from being on fire, have not been prioritized by people who have different interests, because the politicians and the people who support them under our current campaign finance system do not reflect the priorities of everyday Americans.
I'm going to start out hopeful, because I think hopeful is important, and I think we need to at least reflect where we're at, and that is democracy is winning. No mistake, there is a serious and ongoing struggle, but democracy is winning. It's not a struggle between Republicans and Democrats in my mind. It's a struggle between people who believe in democracy over authoritarianism. It's people who believe in facts, data, and science over lies and conspiracy theories. It is not a partisan divide. It is a divide amongst values amongst people. And if you look at the 2020 election, we had historic turnout during the worst health crisis the world has faced in a century, right? We forget that. Like, it's like in COVID is like the afterthought or the footnote. It's not all bad news. Like Nevada, for example, just passed a comprehensive voting rights bill. You haven't heard much about it because we like to report bad news and not good news. But it's comprehensive, positive, sort of for the people-ish, for Nevada. It includes a provision that every registered active voter will receive a ballot by mail, because we know more people vote if they get their ballots ahead of time, right? Our whole mission is making sure that whatever the laws are that relate to voting are implemented in a way that creates the highest level of access, right? And we use data, and we use organizing, and we use communications to make that process work for people. Make sure that election officials are not overly restricted, that they exercise their judgment in a way that maximizes the number of voices that are heard rather than minimizes it. And that's a process that's going on right now. For 2022. It's happening right now in almost every state. We're starting to plan for next year, and election officials are starting to plan, and we can impact that process. Second point is continuing to push for the federal legislation. Absolutely critical. It sets like universal minimum standards for voting and requires that jurisdictions that have a long history of discrimination get permission before changing their voting laws. That's the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. So those two critical pieces of legislation are critical. And then the third thing, which goes back to the first question, is educating our communities and mobilizing them to really understand that like voting is the last act in a civic engagement process that they should be involved in now. Getting the national funders that fund this kind of work to actually see that and to recognize that and to embrace that, and to really get folks involved so that we ensure that the 2022 elections are even more successful than the 2020 elections. So without a doubt, we're facing serious threats to our democracy. We need to encourage businesses, community leaders, thoughtful voices on both sides of the aisle to stand up for democracy and truth and justice. And then we can make sure that every voice is heard, and we can create a democracy that reflects us all. Is there a party that seems to be more enamored with lies and conspiracy theories at this point in history? Yes, I think there is. Does that party attract a very mix of people? Somewhat. But I think a broader coalition of people believe in truth and democracy and freedom and justice, and are fighting for a broader set of values. And so I don't think it's monolithic. I'm not Republican or Democrat as regards voting rights advocacy. I'm for access to people to express their voice and to pick people that reflect their values and their issues in their community. And will there always be some voters in various communities that are going to vote this way or that way? Yes. But what we want to see are politicians that actually care about their people and understand their people and vote with their people. So when Elizabeth talked about a single mother in Congress who in fact knows what that means, or someone who was actually homeless, or somebody who tended a bar, I want that to happen more. And I think the more that happens, the more America will reflect the values of all Americans and not just who the rich and powerful people want us to represent.
The bright side, there's a couple bright sides to date. One is that thousands of people have made their voices heard. And because of my limited time, I'm not going to go into it, but this has looked like people driving from El Paso to Austin. That's a 16-hour drive to testify in the Capitol. I spoke at a rally in Austin a couple weeks ago, and there were well over 500 people in attendance over voting rights. I honestly have done this work for a long time. I never thought in my life I would see that. We have seen thousands of calls to lawmakers, and our coalition of community groups alone has well over 100 community groups that have been actively engaged and united. That's a lot of people. Ultimately, because of all of this, this pressure and opposition, there was a very dramatic moment a couple of weeks ago at the 11th hour of our legislative session when, driven by our Mexican American Legislative Caucus and our Black Legislative Caucus, lawmakers walked out, deprived quorum, and therefore killed the bill because it was right at the end of the legislative session. I will say, again, as someone who's done this for a long time, you know, even the most feisty of legislative floor debates are usually not like an action movie. And it was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen in my career. And again, around voting rights, around this issue of the heart of our democracy. Look, this fight is far from over. I do take a lot of hope in this grassroots movement, this broad-based movement we've seen against the bill. I actually think it's very hopeful that lawmakers, when questioned by reporters, that they keep changing their opinion on the bill. You know, the governor said he's going to call a special session, but we don't know, that hasn't been scheduled yet. And you know, for all the reasons Elizabeth said, I mean, I do have, you know, look, this is a moment for federal lawmakers to step up. And I think that they have history on their side. They have moral clarity on their side. They have data and facts on their side. They have public opinion on their side. You know, yes, it's going to take some courage, but quite frankly, in my biased opinion, you should have some courage if you're trying to represent the people of the United States of America. So I'm holding out some hope that we will get some help from the feds, while at the same time, we're going to continue to, you know, fight like hell, quite frankly, to protect our democracy in Texas.
Well, thank you. I loved this briefing. People spoke with passion and with real experience and practical examples. A last question for each of you, if you could answer it in 30 seconds. Is there a point at which you fear people will lose faith in voting?
And I think that is the lesson to America, is you realize that people who have for too long been in power because of institutional racism, because of patriarchy, because of all of these systems of oppression in America that have always told you don't get a seat at the table, they are afraid right now that you will recognize your power and that you will use it. And that is why we see Americans coming to the table, because what if this country belonged to everybody?
And so we can, they want us to feel defeated. They're attacking everything in every way to keep us feeling defeated. But we just turned out the best election ever under the most adverse circumstances in a century. And none of us are celebrating that every day. We should be celebrating that every day. And the more we celebrate that every day, the more likely it is they won't win the sort of the hearts and minds in terms of making us feel losing hope. We're not going to lose hope.
Thank you. Never, ever in my career thought I would see thousands of people in the streets in the hot Texas sun to, you know, show up to fight for their democracy. And these are people from all walks of life. And if that doesn't make you hopeful about the future of our democracy, I don't know what would.